So we'll be starting our next session right now, which is looking at alleviating the crisis with alternative solutions. So who we have here, we'll do a quick, after kind of detailing the structure of the session, each speaker will introduce themselves with their name, their organization, and briefly what their organization would do. And so how this would work is that in terms of the structure, there will be 7 minutes per speaker, 5 minutes at the end for any questions from the audience before we move into breakout rooms in 1.002, 1.009, and 1.010 for 20 minutes for workshop activities. And finally, we'll look at a 20-minute session on maybe reflections from each session, and finally looking at a panel Q&A. And so, shall we start with Sean? Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, folks. Thanks for inviting me here today. I'm Sean Benstead. I'm a senior researcher at the Centre for Local Economic Strategies. We're a think-do tank who focuses on community wealth building as an approach to local economic development for people, planet, and place. And I'll give you a very quick intro to community wealth building in my 7-minute open talk. Thanks, Mia.
My name's Maeve Cotton. I came to Manchester University and helped found post-crash economics, so it's a joy to be here. I work for an organisation called Social Guarantee, and it's a campaign and an advocacy group trying to push the concept of the social guarantee, which I will go into great detail about.
I'm Dave Beck. I'm a lecturer in social policy and sociology at the University of Salford. I'm here representing my research interest as well, which is called the Universal Basic Income Lab, or UBI Lab. So we look at how a universal basic income could change people's lives.
Amazing. So, Maeve, would you like to start first by introducing the social guarantee?
Yes, thank you very much. Right, so I'm going to talk about the social guarantee, which, as I say, is both an organisation and a concept. And I'm going to spend, because I thought it was fitting, most of my time talking about how it sort of compares to mainstream economics and differs from it, as well as how I think it'll be quite obvious as to how it can help alleviate the cost of living crisis, but I will talk a bit about that as well. So, what is the social guarantee? Next slide, please. Right, so basically there are certain things that we all need in life. It doesn't matter where you are, when you are, what culture you're from, what ethnicity you are. We all need these fundamental things like housing, education, transport, healthcare. And basically, in a nutshell, the social guarantee says the meeting of these needs should be the point of our economic system. So, what does that mean? So some needs can be met individually. So we all buy our own clothes and buy our own food, but obviously more and more during the cost of living crisis, even getting those basics is becoming harder and harder for a larger number of people. There are other things that we need, which people also tend to buy themselves, things like housing and transport, but they're much more expensive and they take up a much higher proportion of people's income. And then finally, there are fundamental needs like education and healthcare that are incredibly expensive to buy yourself. And all but the very richest in society would have to go without if they had to pay for these things themselves. But regardless of cost, all of these things are absolutely essential. So an economy based on meeting people's needs requires collective action, right? It means pooling our resources to ensure that everyone can have access to these services that meet their needs, regardless of how much money they have. So they're the two principles of the social guarantee. It's meeting people's needs and collective action. And in practice, it looks like this. So it's making sure that everybody has enough money to buy the things that they need, and this is done through a living income, through good, properly waged work, and a minimum income guarantee, which ensures that nobody falls below a certain income standard, and then universal services. So these are either affordable or free at the point of use services that provide and meet these essential needs that we have. Right, next slide, please, Ross. So how does this differ from mainstream economics? So, as I said, the social guarantee is about meeting people's needs, whereas mainstream economics focuses on satisfying wants and preferences. Needs are fundamentally different to wants. So firstly, needs are essential. whereas wants are not necessarily so. And just to be clear, you can want the things that you need. Doesn't mean that they're the same things. Wants and needs are sort of fundamentally different. So, for example, I absolutely need food, and I only want a bigger television, right? So, secondly, needs can't be substituted for one another. So it doesn't matter how big my house is, how many cars I have, I'm going to need an education. I'm also going to need healthcare if I want to participate in society. So you can't substitute healthcare for housing. You can't substitute transport for education. Whereas many wants can be replaced with one another. I want to go on a holiday to Turkey, but I would make do with a holiday to Spain. And lastly, and possibly most importantly, well, I think this is very important in the context that we're in, needs are satiable, right? I can have enough healthcare, I can have enough food. In fact, if I have too much food, it becomes bad for me. If I have too much security, for example, it can restrict my freedom. So having too much of what you need can actually be damaging, but you can have enough. Wants and preferences aren't. You can have an unlimited amount of wants, and you can build your wants throughout your life for the rest of your life. So because an economic system based on meeting people's needs prioritises necessities for all over luxuries for a few, and because it's based on sufficiency, on making sure that everybody has enough of what they need, it's fundamentally more ecologically sound, right? There's limits to what people need. Next slide, please, Ross. So, sorry, this is a terrible picture, but I'm sure you've all heard of donut economics. Social guarantee is the social floor of the donut. It's this inner ring of the donut. And meeting people's needs through collective measures is absolutely essential if we're going to have a just transition, right? We simply cannot green our economic system while and at the same time ensure social justice without pooling the resources that we have and creating public luxury rather than private luxury, and ensuring that people have access to the things they need, free at the point of use or genuinely affordable. And I'll speak a little bit more about that in a slide or so. Finally, an economy based on people's needs, meeting people's needs is not market-based and it's not competition-based. So needs can be met by a variety of different service providers, from national governments to local cooperatives to community organisations. I'm sure Sean will speak a bit more about these types of organisations in his talk. But through collectively providing services, it means that we're collaborating rather than competing with each other. Great. Markets might still exist, but providers would be bound by social licenses, which require them to meet certain democratically decided standards of environmental and social good. And finally, the aim of the economy will be meeting people's needs rather than economic growth. I'm going to talk very briefly about benefits. I'm going to focus on sustainability. Basically, as I say, social guarantee is the bedrock of a sustainable economy. Having everybody buy their own things is inherently more wasteful. So a really obvious example would be transport. Everybody having their own car is going to be more wasteful and more ecologically taxing than having an adequate public transport system. Equality, so people on low incomes, as we've seen through the cost of living crisis, spend a much higher proportion of their income on these things like energy and housing. So providing these free or genuinely affordable in kind at the point of use will benefit people on low incomes a lot more and is fundamentally redistributive. It's more efficient because it takes away profit extraction, and it builds solidarity because it's about saying we as a society will not let anybody fall below this certain standard. It's not building a safety net that you can put holes through, it's a floor through which no one can fall and everyone can build a good life. So briefly on the cost of living crisis, last slide please. So we can see what happens when you don't invest in these essentials. So people can't access the care they need, people can't get about without a car in the UK at the minute. I mean, I'm late because my train was so delayed. Families are having to choose between paying for childcare or working because it's so expensive. Owning a home will be unachievable for lots of people of your generation. And these things, housing, healthcare, transport, these are all absolutely essential for all of us. And when we don't have them, we all suffer. So austerity policies have destroyed the lives and the economy. We're lagging behind Europe because people who can't access doctor's appointments are less productive, right? People who live in insecure, cold housing are less productive. People who aren't able to afford public transport are less productive. So the economy depends on people. It's the sum total of all of our social interactions, our purchases, our work, and if we are not well, our economy is not well. So a secure and healthy population is the foundation of a strong economy and the foundation of the social guarantee. So thank you.
Thank you. Alright, and next we have Sean from class, if you'd like to start the presentation.
Yeah, of course. Do you want to just skip straight to the next slide there? Cheers. I've already introduced myself. What a tough act to follow. So the case for community wealth building, what is it and what problem does it seek to tackle? A quick show of hands, who has heard of community wealth building? Good few. Alright, well in 7 minutes time you'll all be experts and you'll be applying for my job. So next slide please, Ross. So we at Clares would frame community wealth building as a common sense approach to local economic development. And it is a progressive approach that is ultimately a set of guiding principles to help us build a more inclusive and people-centred economy which redirects wealth and value back into the communities while placing control of the generation of that value and wealth into the hands of local people through effecting ownership. And that is in contrast to our current economic model. Next slide please, Ross. Which is, in short, an economic model where a lot of economic activity and output is created for the purpose of wealth extraction through profiteering. A model where the local regeneration that we see is overly reliant on the hopes that the benefits of inward investment of multinationals will naturally trickle down to our local communities and serve to level up our places of persistent deprivation. So if you just take a walk around Manchester, you'll see that there is plenty of economic activity. But this tends to be low-wage work for locals and high-wage work for transient populations. And it is an economic model that where the purpose of business is to extract wealth for the benefit of distant shareholders. So just think about your companies like Amazon, Airbnb, big superstars and supermarket retailer monopolies. Now what's wrong with this? Next slide please, Ross. While economic growth has roughly doubled in the UK over the last 30 years, this growth has failed to produce social, economic and climate benefits for all but a select few. Now this graph that you can see up here shows UK GDP growing at 2019, the pink line, mapped against a declining average income, shown on the blue line, and an increasing rate of poverty, shown in the yellow line. So while record numbers of people in the UK now live in poverty, life expectancy has recently stalled for the first time in a century, and the climate emergency is escalating rapidly with the likelihood that the world will reach a climate tipping point sooner than originally forecast. But it's not all doom and gloom, because although most of us aren't doing very well, some of us are doing very well indeed. In the UK, the 5 richest families own more wealth than 13.2 billion people. Over the last 10 years, the number of billionaires in the UK has almost doubled, and their wealth has more than doubled. And the richest 1% of people in the UK own the same wealth as 80% of the population. That is 53 million people. So in short, the economic growth that we've seen is exclusive. It does not benefit the majority, and in the context of a cost of living crisis, with rising prices and record profits, these disparities become even more pronounced. Next slide, please, Ross. So in seeking to challenge this exclusivity then, a community wealth building approach is about purposeful intervention in the economy. And to do this, community wealth building aims to change the nature of our local economies by harnessing the economic and social power of locally rooted institutions. Now these are commonly referred to as anchor institutions. Now typically these are your local councils, your hospitals, your universities, your colleges and housing associations, and potentially large private sector companies too, but the jury is still out on that one. Ask me about that later. So what characteristics do these institutions necessarily have to make them such important economic actors? These institutions usually have an important presence in place, usually through a combination of being large-scale employers, the largest purchasers of goods and services within a locality, or controlling large areas of land, or having relatively fixed assets. And they're all tied to a particular place by their mission, by their histories, by their physical assets, and by their local relationships. For example, there's little chance of an NHS trust hoofing it off to another city or town. And these are also organisations that can come together over time to create what you would call anchor networks. where organisations come together in partnership to utilise their combined economic heft to respond to local needs and crises. So what tools do they have? Yeah, cheers. So in Claire's we talk about community wealth building action across 4 key pillars or levers of activity, with a governing aim or objective of pluralising the ownership of the local economy and ensuring workers are gaining a greater and growing proportion of that surplus within the local economy. So going around clockwise, socially productive use of land and property. So anchors can utilise and manage their land and property in ways which ensure that they generate wealth for local citizens, such as using land for the production of community-owned energy, for example. Making financial power work, so anchors can channel investment to local communities, including through local investment of their pension funds and disinvesting from fossil fuels. They can also target their employment from lower income areas into fair trade union jobs, pay the living wage and build progression routes for communities suffering from economic inactivity or generational unemployment. And finally, anchor institutions can use their own purchasing power, so their procurement of goods and services, to channel that demand to support progressive business, local employment and support worker-controlled enterprise, whether that be worker co-ops, social enterprise and the likes. So if you'd like to join me shortly in the workshop, we can collectively explore what the university can do by way of these interventions and within the context of a cost of living crisis. So that is your whistle-stop introduction. I hope you're all experts. Woo.
All right, thank you so much, Sean. And last but definitely not least, so we have Dave from UBI Lab, if you'd like to do a brief introduction.
Yep, thanks very much. You thought that was difficult to follow. I haven't prepared anything. I usually wing everything, and I'll stand up because I'm short. So my name's Dave, as I said. I am a lecturer in social policy, but I'm also part of an international approach at looking at universal basic income. Just as a quick show of hands, has anybody heard of basic income? Yeah? Okay, so the way we look at universal basic income may be different than what you have heard, because it does come under quite a few names. If you might just want to move on slides, so I think I'll put them all on one slide. So we've got some general principles, but first of all, we call it a universal basic income, but it does come under other names such as a citizen's income or just a basic income or a citizen's dividend, so it comes under quite a few different titles. So when I talk about basic income, I'm usually talking about what's called a universal basic income, which has these central principles in that it is universal, and what we mean by universal is that everybody gets it. Okay? Every single person who is a citizen of a country or living in that country gets an income from the government as a dividend every month. Okay, so you can think of this as like maybe £1,000 a month. Everybody receives £1,000 a month. Okay, from the month you're born to the month you die, everybody receives an income from the government every month. It's unconditional, and the reason why it's unconditional is probably what we've been talking about already this morning. Is the system that we've currently got doesn't seem to work. The approach to social security that we have now is highly conditional, and since 2010, more so since 2013, when the coalition government brought in the Welfare Reform Act 2012, our approach to social security here in the UK is highly conditional, which means that if you need to access social security, you've got to jump through several hoops. And in order to jump through those hoops, you've got to prove that you are doing what the government has asked you to do. So, for example, if the government tell you need to apply for 10 jobs every month and you only apply for 9 of those jobs, the government can take your social security away from you. This is called a sanction. Since 2013, sanctions have risen through the roof in job centre plus areas. So a universal basic income is unconditional. There are no conditions attached to it whatsoever. The government will not monitor your behaviour. They won't ask you what you're doing. You can do whatever you want with the money. It's your money. So if you think about if you've got £1,000 a month, and this is what we're going to be looking at in our workshop later, what would you do with £1,000 a month for the rest of your life? You receive it, your husband or your wife receives it, so it could be £2,000 extra in your household. I'm really interested to hear what these two speakers have also said as well, because the idea that we're looking at as a basic income isn't really in opposition to what you've already heard. It could be complementary. So it's also known as role. I've discussed that. It's individual, so it's paid directly to you as an individual. So you may receive it, your wife will receive it, or husband receives it. There are also other approaches in where children receive it as well. This kind of does happen already through things such as child benefit. However, for a universal basic income, what we look at in our lab, possibly around about £300 per child. That's my approach to it. So £300 per child rises to, when they reach 18, it'll go up and they'll be an adult and they'll receive the same amount as an adult. So, as probably heard from the discussions before, I'm really interested in understanding the current system that we've got in universities. So, as a lecturer, personal tutor as well for the students in my university, I'm really, really worried at the minute about poverty that my students are experiencing. I think over the past month, I've probably received 10 to 15 emails from students who say, sorry Dave, I can't come today. And the reason why they can't come, if they want to tell me, when we've got down to the bottom of the conversation, is they've got no money. I had a student this week email me to say, I'm sorry I can't attend again this week, but I do only have 9 pence left in my bank. And this is a student with children. So where I work at Salford University, we're a very working class university. A lot of our students don't live on a campus. A lot of our students at Salford University are first generation students. They are the first in their family to go to university. For some people, it is their second career. They've done a job, they've come into education, and they're making a go of it. They've got children, they've got full-time jobs. Some of my students have got more than full-time jobs. So some are working 2 or 3 jobs over 40 hours a week, and then trying to be a student as well. Full-time student with children. So what we're starting to see is this compounding problem with the cost of living, which is really, really severely impacting our students. So if you can't attend university because you've only got 9 pence in your bank, how do you be a student? How would a student dedicate themselves to wanting to learn? How does a student then go home, think about what they've learned and apply it to their assessment? How do they then use that to then as a vehicle to go and get a job if they can't really allow what they've learned to seep in? So what we're looking at as part of our UBI lab is how we can work better with students, or how would a universal basic income really help benefit students today? So for those of you who do also teach in here, are also probably really aware of ChatGPT. Worried about ChatGPT, right? We know that students tend to, what we call, this academic misconduct happens. And a lot of that is because students have got a lot of pressure. So if you're working a full-time job, you've got 2 children, and then you've got university assessments to submit as well, and you're thinking, I've left these because these are not as important at the minute as earning enough money to pay my rent, so I'm going to leave my essays. And it gets to the deadline, and then you're thinking, I've not really got enough time. I can just go and pay an essay mill to write the essay for me, which we know happens. Now we've got ChatGPT, which has come along, which can write the essay for you almost instantaneously. So what a universal basic income would allow you to do is just stop. It will put a pause, it will put a break on certain parts of your poverty, which would allow you to say, do you know what? I don't need to work this many hours. I can work a few hours. I've still got time to look after my children as well, but I can really dedicate myself to being a student. So that's what we're looking at. I do think that we're at this time where the cost of living is really a cost of capitalism. We cannot afford the rich we've got. I mean, you had some fantastic statistics about the rise of inequality in the UK. Maybe think about something in terms of a global approach. Did you know that the 22 richest men in the world have got more money than every single woman on the whole African continent? This is wrong. The world that we're living in is broken. A universal basic income, we're hoping, will change this top-down capitalist system into a bottom-up capitalist system, because money is power. And when you have money, you have more power. And a universal basic income hopes to give you more power every single month. Okay? Thank you very much.